Good afternoon. I'm William Harris, the acting director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And thank you for being with us this afternoon. And I would like to introduce our speaker today, who's going to talk about her book, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line. Uh, um, it's a great volume which covers some unexplored territory about the women who played a really key role during World War II. I'd like to introduce Mary Kay Eder, retired Major General Mary Kay Eder, in fact. Thank you for being with us today, Mary Kay. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Well, I retired from the Army in 2013 and decided I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to write. I wanted to write fiction, but it seemed that these stories were pursuing me, and so I started saving them, and here they are.
Oh, well, we're so glad that you're able to share them with us today.
Thank you. So before I get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the stories did pursue me. And the truth is, in 2017, I was asked to speak at a conference. I was a substitute, a last-minute ad, and I had been reading certain obituaries. So I had saved some of them because they were fascinating stories in themselves. And I used one of them for that presentation. And I kept collecting them. But by 2019, I didn't know what I was going to do with them. And then in October, at the Emmy Awards, Alex Borstein received the Emmy for Best Supporting Actress for her work in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And when she stood up, she said, "In World War II, my grandmother was about to be shot into a pit. She turned to the guard and said, 'What happens if I step out of line?' And he said, 'Well, I don't have the heart to shoot you, but somebody will.' She stepped out of line. And for that, I am here today. And for that, my children are here today. So step out of line, ladies. Step out of line." If we'll go to the first slide, I'll start to tell you about some of them. I have probably 15 people I talk about in depth in this book. So I'm only going to talk maybe about half of them today. But I do want to tell you about Stephanieczer. Now, in 1942, on May 14th, President Roosevelt signed into law the provision that women could be admitted into the Army and the Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Now, Stephanie joined a little bit later, but when she did, it was because she couldn't find a job, she didn't have anything challenging, and she wanted to make a difference, as so many people did during those years. So she signed up to join the Women's Army Corps and was sent to Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And after about 6 months or so there, she decided, I need something more. I need something more of a challenge. One of her friends said, "Well, you should try to join the OSS, the Office of Special Services, sometimes known then as Oh So Secret or Oh So Special." Well, Stephanie's parents were immigrants from Poland, and she didn't speak English till she was in grade school. So she spoke Polish like a native. And that was one of the things that helped her get selected for the OSS. You see her here on the right as a captain in the Women's Army Corps. And by the end of World War II, she was assigned to London, the London office of the OSS, there with the embassy, traveling the countryside through France, through Germany, writing reports, and then received her first assignment, her first real assignment, because she was X2 with the OSS. Now, there were only several hundred people assigned to X2, undercover agents, counterintelligence. She ended up in Warsaw, right at the end of the war. And her cover was completely to be a Polish citizen, or an American Polish citizen, who was there working for the ambassador. She traveled the countryside pretending to look for relatives while she was making reports on Russians, what was happening politically. It was a dangerous time. There were all kinds of refugees. There were Nazis on the run. And after she'd been there for about 6 months, she was outed by someone in the Paris office and had to return home. But she married a pilot. Now, this is Bill Rader, who became a major general in the Army Air Corps and then the Air Force. She met him while she was in London, but she never talked about her time with the OSS, and she never talked about anything that she did that was classified. In 2008, when those files were declassified, the OSS Society, which is like an alumni group, found her and asked her to join. Then they realized what she had done in Poland, much of which is still classified, and looked at her records from the Army. She'd never received any kind of an award. So they were instrumental in getting the Legion of Merit presented to her. Stephanie passed away in 2017. This picture is from her funeral at Arlington, where she was presented with the Legion of Merit. Now, at the same time, if we'll go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about Charity Adams Early. There were African American women coming into the Women's Army Corps at the same time, as well as into the Women's Army pieces, the women's pieces of both the Navy and the Marine Corps. Now, Charity was one of the 10 percenters. One of about 10% of all of the women joining could be African American. She was the first African American woman commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army, in the Women's Army Corps. Now, she too was at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and she too was bored after a while and wanted a new challenge. She was asked for command. She kept asking, I need the challenge. I need something more to do. So in early 1945, she's on a plane on her way to London and was told not to open the envelope until they were halfway across the Atlantic. Then as she opens it, she realizes that she has been selected to command the only all-women, all-African-American Central Postal Battalion, the 6888 in England. This was quite a challenge. Other units had been given this assignment and they'd failed. But Charity was always the best prepared person in the room, and she was determined to make it work. Now, when you read about units going for World War II or getting ready, training, many of them trained for a long time before they deployed together. She met the people in her unit for the first time when they landed in Scotland and then traveled down to Birmingham. We see so many pictures of her unit then because they were doing a parade 3 days after she arrived. She met her new commander there, the 2-star general in charge of the communications zone, and he said, "So can your troops march?" And she said, "Oh, yes, sir, yes, sir." She had no idea whether they could march or not. But they performed well in this, and then they got down to what the work was. In airport hangars, Charity had them look, there was 17 million pieces of mail that hadn't been delivered for over 2 years because the pace of operations, the pace of operations was so great. So she divided her troops into 3 shifts. They worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and processed 56,000 pieces of mail per shift. Now, this includes Christmas packages that had been left from the last 2 years. Some mail was addressed, I think 7,500 pieces to Robert Smith, and that was it. Some were addressed simply to Junior and had to be backtracked. They were given 6 months to accomplish this. She got it done in 3. And of course, being the Army, you know what that means. When you do something well, you get more work to do. So then they were sent to Rouen, France, where they did the same. The unit was disestablished at the end of the war. People went home to no parades, very little thanks, no awards. Now, it wasn't until 2018 that there was a monument built to honor this unit, and this is at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And down here to the right, you see retired Master Sergeant Elizabeth Helm putting her hand on this statue and saying to herself, "We stand on their shoulders." They also received a Meritorious Unit Award. And then for the last year, there has been a push nationwide to provide the Congressional Gold Medal to this very singular and greatly under-rewarded unit. And just this week, President Biden signed it into law that the Congressional Gold Medal will be awarded to this unit. I'll go to the next slide, and I'll tell you about the women who flew. So Jackie Cochran, who had been a stunt pilot in the 1930s, she was fairly well known. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt in 1939 saying, "I think that there should be a role for women in flying, in being part of the military. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt had had flying lessons, so she was well aware that women could do this. And in her daily column, she actually advocated for it in early 1941 and 42, and said, if we're at war now, we need to use every weapon we have, and we need to employ these women as pilots. This is Ola Mildred Rexroth, known as Millie. Now, Millie joined in 1943. And when Millie joined, she was the only Native American woman to become a pilot. By the time she graduated pilot training, late in 1944, she was in class 44-7. The program was almost over, but she didn't know it. There was a move to keep the WASP, Women Air Service Pilots, as part of the Army Air Corps. But at the time, General Hap Arnold realized that many of the pilots were starting to return already from Europe. The 8th Air Force in England had 350,000 men assigned to it. And he just didn't see a future for women as pilots. So the program was disestablished in December. So Millie, who graduated in October, found herself out of a job just a few months later. She never flew again. Many of them didn't. Many of them had asked about flying in some way, shape, means, form with the Air Corps and later the Air Force, and were told the public wouldn't stand for it as commercial pilots. She became an air traffic controller, and that's what she did for the next 20-so years before she retired from the Air Force. This picture in the center is from one of their bomber jackets, and this is on display at the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah. Their little mascot was named Fifinella, Fifi, and you see her here, because Disney provided a number of these mascots for all types of Army units, and Fifi was the one who helped pilots land safely, which was a good thing for Millie. In one of her early days, after she graduated, her job was to pull targets for ground crews and for aerial crews to try to shoot the target off the back of the plane. And so one of the things she did one day was go a little too slowly, and they shot the target completely off. So by the time she landed, the instructor came up to her and said, the guy shot the trailer off your plane. You need to go pick it up. And he gave her the keys to the Jeep. What he didn't know was Millie couldn't drive. She could fly a plane, but she didn't know how to drive a car. So apparently this was quite a funny view, seeing her bouncing across the field, because she didn't know how to shift either, until she got the target and brought it back. There was a Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the WASP, and in the smaller picture here, you see Millie wearing it at a 4th of July event at Mount Rushmore in 2010. She passed away several years ago. And then there was also a movement to correct how the WASP had been used during the war. They were told they would be commissioned as lieutenants in the Army Air Corps, and they were not. In the end, they were made civilians, government employees. And so the fight was on to get them recognized as veterans. And Millie is buried now at Arlington National Cemetery, close to where she used to work, which was where the old Army War College was at Fort McNair, very close to being able to see the planes take off at Reagan, which she did before she joined. So let me tell you about a couple of people who are not military. And I'll go to the next slide and tell you a little bit about Ruth Gruber. Ruth Gruber grew up in New York City, and by the time she was 19, she had a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin. She then traveled to Germany, and this is in 1932, 1933, and finished her doctorate. At that time, she was the youngest person in the world to have a doctoral degree. She got a job with a newspaper after returning home to New York and was sent to the Soviet Gulag, where she wrote a book about the conditions there under communism. A man named Harold Ickes read that article in that book and decided he needed to have her work for him. Now, Harold Ickes was I'm probably saying his name wrong. I do pronounce many of them incorrectly. He was the Secretary of the Interior under President Roosevelt, the longest held the job for the longest time of any cabinet secretary at that time. He'd been there, he was there 13 years by the time he left in 1946. He sent Ruth on one of her first jaunts, and that was to Alaska. You see this iconic picture of here to the left from her trip to Alaska. And what she was sent there to do was to look at the possibility of, after the war, of Alaska opening up as a place for returning servicemen to resettle. She spoke out about that quite frequently, and she was becoming well known. And right about that time, President Roosevelt decided to open up the ability for refugees to come to the U.S. There was some political issues between the State Department, the Department of the Interior, and what the president wanted. So he decided to make 1,000 refugees eligible to come to the United States as his guests. When that happened, Ruth went into her boss's office and said, you know, these people are going to be traumatized. This is not going to go well unless you have somebody there with them. And he said, you're absolutely right, Ruth, you should go. So she became the escort for the nearly 1,000. I think in the end, there were about 855 of them, refugees coming to the US. This picture on the lower right is of her with some of them as they sailed into New York Harbor. And these refugees saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time. They were sent to Oswego, New York, to a former Army camp that had barbed wire, that had guards. And many of them were horribly frightened at seeing this. But over the next year, after having been debriefed, after having begun to adjust to American life, their time behind the bars was over. And many of them stayed, some few went home. But she would always say in later life, look at what they've accomplished. Look at what these people were able to do just by having the chance and the opportunity to come to America. This was also a movie a few years ago with Natasha Richardson playing Ruth Gruber. She was prolific. She wrote so many books, I think 17 in total. She was in Israel when the ship Exodus was turned away by the British. She basically saw every major event politically in the 20th century. And I've always been terrifically impressed by what she did. But I want to tell you about another reporter as well, or one who started as a reporter. So on the next slide, I'll let you meet Betty McIntosh. Now, Betty's written 5 or 6 books too, but they're sometimes hard to find because Betty was married 3 times. So you can find books she's written under the name Elizabeth MacDonald and Elizabeth Hepner. She wrote 2 children's books that way. But here she is now also joining the OSS. She started out as a newspaper reporter in Hawaii. She covered Pearl Harbor, but it was decided at the time that her coverage was so intense that it couldn't be printed. It didn't appear in print until it showed up in the Washington Post. I think the year was 2010. So Betty is now covering the White House. She gets moved and also working for a newspaper in Washington. She covered the White House and she covered quite a few of Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences and what she was doing. But she too wanted to go overseas. And she kept saying, I want to go to Japan. I want to go to the Far East. Well, one day she was assigned to interview a man who had been a friend of her father's back in Honolulu. And he said, so you want to do something different? And she said, yes, I want to go overseas. He said, well, I think that can be arranged. Excuse me. And then she found herself in the OSS without knowing a thing about it or what it was. She was assigned first to Burma and then finally to China, which was where she had wanted to be. Her job in the OSS was in a division called Morale Operations. She did misinformation and disinformation. Her boss was Wild Bill Donovan, Major General Wild Bill Donovan, a man who earned the Medal of Honor in World War I. And this picture in the lower left is showing him visiting her offices in Burma. And she is the third to the right from General Donovan. He also wrote the introduction to her autobiography that she published in 1946, although he was not pleased that she referred to him as a penguin in a suit. And when he complained about it, she said, well, that's what you look like. That's it. She met her second husband while in China. Actually, it was because his dog liked her and went home with her, and he was then forced to go look for his dog. So Betty continued to work for the OSS until it was disestablished after the war. And when it was disestablished, General Donovan was no longer welcome. That whole complex array of talent that had been part of the OSS and its missions were divided up. The research piece went to the State Department. The piece that was X2 stayed with what would become the CIA. The morale piece, the disinformation piece, went to the CIA as well. Now, at that time, Betty's second husband had passed away, and she decided, I need something to do. I need another challenge. She went to the head of the CIA and said, can I come back? So we know nothing about her next 20 or so years with the CIA because it was classified. But she said that she got to know General Donovan fairly well after the war. She didn't know him that well. During it, he was always austere and far away. But there's one other part of the OSS I want to tell you about, and that is the cartography division. That's the next slide. So this is Marion Frieswick. Now, Marion, and I've talked with her, and when I talked with her, I was asking her about these globes, the giant globes that President Roosevelt had in his office, that General Marshall had sent also to England as a gift. But she told me, no, we didn't make those. She said, right when I started, we were shipping that one globe to London, and it wouldn't fit through the door of the cargo plane. So Marion and her colleagues had to cut it in half to get it onto the plane so it could be shipped. What she did do in the cartography division was, along with her team of cartographers and draftsmen, was begin to build the first maps that were used for intelligence purposes. Maps have been around for centuries, but they had never been used in this sense that they could be helpful for planning or for decision making. Her team was actually assigned, and this was her first assignment, to build a topographic map of Sicily. And this was supposed to be useful in planning for how the troops would land and where they would go through the mountains. Now, at that time in Washington, every available building was used for offices. And so Marion's office was actually in the old Ford's Theater. So she was there with her team one night at 2 a.m, building this topographic map when they realized the plaster hadn't set. So they pick this 40-pound map up, haul it over to the balcony, and have to wipe off that bad plaster, which falls down 3 stories and lands right in front of the booth where President Lincoln was shot. I always imagine her in later years going to a Christmas play at Ford's Theater and looking at that. She also met her husband there. He was another team member. And they both worked for the CIA for a number of years after the war. And this picture of the map is actually the map that hung in her living room. So after she left the CIA, her husband stayed on. And when he was going to receive his 50-year pin from the CIA for government service, they gave him this map. She had gone to work that day to pick him up in the Volkswagen Beetle, and they had to open up the sunroof in order to get that map into the car and get it home. Now, her daughters have told me this is the only map produced by the OSS that ever left the CIA, and they want it back. She said, but we're not giving it. So I think that is a fascinating story as to how those started, and certainly how a whole career field was created. So there is so much that we owe to the OSS for how it started, what it did, and to General Donovan who was actually quite close with President Roosevelt and how he built it. So with that, I would really like to just take your questions and see what you want to talk about with this book and with other folks in it.
Well, what strikes me initially, and it's a question I want to just jump in and ask, is how did you narrow it down to 15 stories? And because that must have been exceptionally difficult in and of itself. And how did you select the ones that are included in the book?
There were some I thought I wanted to tell originally, and some I wanted to tell even though they were fairly well known, like the story of Virginia Hall. She is known as being a spy. She was not a spy in the OSS's definition. She was in the division called Operations, so she was more of a special operator. I didn't know anything about Alice either, Alice Marble, the tennis player. I did not know her story and was absolutely fascinated with what she did in so many arenas. You talk about a life not only well lived, but has an impact and a legacy that echoes down through the generations.
Yes.
So, yes, I had many more stories than I could fit. I had some that didn't work out where I couldn't find family members or photos or research to accompany it. And of course, once I finished the book, I kept finding more.
That's always the case, isn't it? Always the case.
Always. Well, I started the project at the beginning of the pandemic. So I had signed the contract to produce the book on 1 February, and they wanted the entire manuscript by 1 May.
Oh, well, that's intense.
It was
during
intense.
the pandemic. Intense.
As we talk about, the Library of Congress is not available. The Holocaust Museum is closed. The National Archives are closed. So I started buying books on eBay, which is good because it took me back to the original research.
Yeah. Well, we do have a question. Why do you think so much of these women's OSS service is still classified, or I might broaden it, is still unknown?
I think some of it was known at the time. And some of it is unknown because people like Stephanieczer didn't want to talk about it. And well, no, I just did my part. I did what I was supposed to do. I made a contribution. That was nothing we don't need to talk about anymore. They didn't see themselves as needing awards or recognition, and many were just very, very humble about what they had done.
It's what strikes me too is the how personal these stories are. It isn't just a resume of professional achievement. It also shows how their lives are balanced, their marriages, their personal lives are also flow through these stories. And I think that that's a nice touch for a work of history. Was that purposeful? Did you want to go deeper beyond just professional achievements?
It was purposeful in two ways. One is I don't think that you have the entire picture of an era or a piece or a page from history until you have all of the stories. There is no one who was alive during that time who was unaffected by what happened in World War II in one way or another. And so to have some of these stories unknown or left out of history or omitted does a disservice to them and a disservice to the entire picture. But for me, in writing them, so many people would say, well, there's the story of what they did. But that's 4 years, 5 years, maybe more. But then there's the rest of life. So how do you go on? And many of them did have issues with, well, I've never felt as alive as I did then, or that was so exciting, I don't think anything else can measure up to it. And of course, many of those who spent time in a concentration camp or who fought with the resistance, they also had PTSD and they had the issues that came with that. So it was taking a complete look at the whole person was what I wanted to do.
And we have another question. What was the nature of the escorting function that Ruth Gruber most likely performed? Was this towards the end of World War II?
Yes, with the ship bringing back the refugees. Actually, she was going to go with them to be like their, not a supervisor, not a monitor, but a champion, because they were on a troop ship with wounded people, wounded soldiers, wounded sailors, and there was some thought that the two groups might not get along. It was also dangerous still crossing the Atlantic. And Ruth's mother objected to her going. She called Secretary Ickes and said, "Hey, I'm not sure I want my daughter to do this. You need to have somebody in charge, like a general." And he said, "You're right. We're going to make her a general." So she went as the general in charge.
So your own military experience, your own, I believe, 36 or almost 40 years of
Yes.
service to your country. How much did that influence the way you approached these women's stories too? Because as you know, some are military and some aren't.
It influenced it a great deal because, in particular, reading some stories, you could tell people who wrote them glossed over parts or didn't explain them in such a way that someone with a background like I have would go, "Oh, no. 10 nurses putting up a tent. Oh, no, that did not go well." Because they would say, "Yeah, and the nurses put up the tent." Well, they put it up every 10 days. They put up all of the tents in the field hospital every 10 days because they're moving behind the frontline units. And sometimes they were more than close to the front lines. It takes about 10 people to get one of those tents up. And while you're being shelled and while you hear armor and artillery, it is not an easy thing to do at all. So I wanted to get to the details that explain more of what was happening. For Stephanieczer, there's a part in her obituary that says, "And a Navy attaché disappeared." What? No. I went back and found the original autobiography written by the American ambassador at the time. Yes, there was a naval attaché who was near a destroyed bridge in the fog, and he fell off. So some of it is correcting misinterpretations or melodrama that is not necessary and wasn't true to get to the real story, which is even better.
Isn't that so often the case that it doesn't need a lot of dressing up around the edges? That just the core of it is so rich of its own.
So rich in such small details. So where Stephanieczer was in Warsaw, the entire city had been destroyed. And Eisenhower said he'd never seen such destruction. There was one building left that had electricity, and that was a hotel where the U.S. Embassy was, and 11 other countries had their consulates. Stephanie said she would go out and walk on the street, and if somebody asked you what time it was, you couldn't look at your watch or they'd steal it. There were people lined up in the street to get water. We forget the conditions they were in,
yes,
in order to be able to do these things.
So as you also look back on your career as a woman in the military, in terms of how you view the experience that these women had during their particular eras of service and accomplishment, do you feel that they laid groundwork for you to build on? Do you feel a part of that story that they often helped initiate as firsts in many ways?
It's interesting because as I found these stories, many of them I would say to myself, "I don't know this. Why don't I know this? Why isn't this taught? Why don't I know these stories already?" Because so many times now we say, "Oh, this is the first person to do it." What they weren't. There were firsts before that. So for the WASP pilots, it wasn't until the 1970s that the Air Force announced we're going to let women be pilots. And the WASP, who were still fighting for recognition, rose up and said, "Oh no, we were first." So it's so important, I think, to not forget what that generation did, because it did, in fact, lay the groundwork, and they have done so many things that we continue to redo, reinvent, retry.
I want to go back to something you said when talking with family members or even some of the people profiled, and that how you are able to draw people out to get beyond a modesty, perhaps even, or a reluctance to speak. What was your background? How did you learn to engage people in that way, to be able to get these stories richer and tell them more completely?
Well, I think so many of us don't ask questions of our grandparents or parents about what did you do, and you have to know enough to know what questions to ask. So I would talk to Betty Robarts, who was worked with Project Ultra. She wasn't a code breaker. she built the code breaking machines.
Mhm.
So she had seen a draft of my book and said, "Oh, I don't know why you have me in there. I didn't do anything compared to the other people in the book." And I said, "Betty, you were 20 years old and you raised your right hand and you signed a blank check to the United States of America and said, I will go wherever you need. I will do whatever you require of me." That's pretty impressive.
It's exceptionally impressive. Do you have plans to go further to do another one? I mean, this is anthology made for television. These 15 stories, and as you said, there's more. Would you like to do more?
Well, from your lips to Netflix ears. Since doing the book, my publisher said, "Why don't you have a newsletter that connects with people who are reading these stories?" And I didn't want to do this at first, but as I started, and again, as things opened up, I found much more material. One of the things you find in this book is how people are connected. They knew each other, they knew of each other, they respected what each other had done. Some of them crossed paths later in life. And being able to continue to find some of these stories and tell them has just been fascinating to me, to continue to find these relationships.
Well, Mary Kay, we just so appreciate you joining us today and talking about your book, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line. These are essential stories. I agree with you. So often, the first we think of first were done by people many years before, and the asking of questions is just vital. The respectful asking of questions, which this book so evidences. So thank you again. The book's title is The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, and we loved that story of how you got the title. It's just so perfect and shows how each person can have an impact of their own. And so good luck, and we hope to see you again with another version, a growing version of the book.
It's going to be sports stars of the 1930s whose lives were interrupted by the Olympics being canceled.
Well, we want to pre-book you then, because that's a fascinating topic. And of course, as I've spoke to you, I'll say this to folks, the Alice Marble story, the great women's tennis player, which we didn't touch on today, and is so pivotal to today, and people don't know who she is, and they should. And there are other people like that. So those are great stories, and we look forward to that one. So
I'll leave you with one line about Alice Marble. You could say that she personally desegregated professional tennis.
She is an unsung hero and voice in the history of tennis and the history of sport, actually, more broadly, much more broadly than just tennis. So, well, thanks for joining us today. And for more information and to continue and to see this program again, you can join us on our social media platforms. And for more information, go to www.fdrlibrary.org. And thank you again, Mary Kay, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.